Who hasn't had one of those moments where something totally small sets you off, and later you're like, why did I even react like that? We all have those emotional triggers, the things that push our buttons and make us snap, or just leave us stuck overthinking. But what if we could understand those emotions better, handle them without losing it, and maybe even turn anger into something useful? Part 1. Resilience and Triggers. The difference between truth and trigger. Let's dive into the concept of emotional triggers. You know that feeling when someone says something small, and all of a sudden, you feel like your insides are on fire? Yeah, that's an emotional trigger in action. It's when something seemingly harmless, or even totally unrelated to your current situation, gets under your skin and makes you react strongly. It's almost like someone pressed a button you didn't even know you had, and boom, emotions are running the show. An emotional trigger is basically an automatic reaction that's connected to past experiences, often tied to something unresolved. It's like if you've ever been in a situation where someone says something as innocent as, "You look tired," and for whatever reason, it feels like a punch to the gut. Maybe because in the past, you had people criticize your appearance when you were feeling vulnerable, or maybe it reminds you of an insecurity you've been carrying for years. Suddenly, that little comment isn't about how tired you look today, it's about all the times you felt judged, or unseen, or not good enough. Emotional triggers take you out of the present moment and drag you back to past emotions. And the worst part? You usually don't even realize it's happening in the moment. Here's a real-world example. Say you're having a completely normal conversation with your partner, and they casually mention that they don't think it's a big deal to leave the dishes in the sink overnight. For them, it's just an opinion, but for you? It hits that old nerve. Maybe growing up, you had parents who were super strict about cleanliness, and leaving dishes out was treated like a crime. So even though your partner's comment is totally neutral, you feel this wave of irritation or even anger. That's a trigger. Your reaction isn't about the dishes, it's about something deeper, something unresolved from your past that still lingers in your emotional world. Emotional triggers aren't logical. They're not about the reality of the moment, they're about the past spilling over into the present. And because they're tied to emotions, they tend to be pretty dramatic. What could have been a normal, calm conversation about household chores suddenly feels like a personal attack, or a sign of disrespect, or whatever your particular trigger connects it to. And that's where things get complicated. So, how do you distinguish between an emotional reaction and objective truth? This is tricky because, in the heat of the moment, everything feels real. When you're triggered, your body and mind are responding as if the threat or the insult is happening right now, in real time. It's like your nervous system can't tell the difference between the past wound and the present situation. But there is a difference, and the key is learning how to step back and figure out what's real and what's emotional baggage. One of the first signs that you're dealing with a trigger is the intensity of your reaction. If your emotional response feels way out of proportion to the actual situation, like you're feeling incredibly upset over something small, that's a red flag. It's not about the dishes or the comment, it's about something bigger. In moments like this, it's crucial to pause and ask yourself, is this really about what's happening right now, or is this tapping into something else? Let's break it down with another example. Imagine you're at work, and your boss gives you some feedback on a project you've been working hard on. They say, this part could use some improvement. It's constructive feedback, right? No big deal. But for some reason, it hits you hard. You feel a wave of defensiveness, or maybe even shame. Now, if you look at the situation logically, there's no reason to take it personally. Your boss is just doing their job. But if, in the past, you've had experiences where you felt like nothing you did was ever good enough, maybe from a teacher, a parent, or even a previous boss, this feedback suddenly feels like a confirmation of that old wound. Your reaction is less about the feedback itself and more about how it echoes those past experiences. It's important to recognize that your emotional reactions aren't the enemy. They're just signals that there's something inside you that needs attention. But they can distort your perception of reality. When you're triggered, it's like putting on a pair of glasses with the wrong prescription. Everything looks a little off. You might see a neutral comment as criticism, or a casual suggestion as an attack. Your emotions distort the way you interpret what's happening, and suddenly, you're reacting to your feelings instead of the facts. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine you're watching a movie, but instead of seeing what's really on the screen, you're seeing clips from a completely different movie that you watched years ago. The scenes don't match up, but your brain can't tell the difference. So, instead of responding to the current movie, you're reacting to the one you saw years ago. That's what triggers do. They superimpose your past emotions onto your present reality. Now, how do you get perspective in moments like these? One practical technique is learning to recognize the physical signs of being triggered. When you're emotionally triggered, your body responds. Maybe your heart starts racing, or your chest feels tight, or you feel a wave of heat. These physical reactions are clues that something deeper is going on. When you notice them, it's your cue to pause. Take a breath, and try to create a little space between what you're feeling and what's actually happening. Another helpful tool is to ask yourself some grounding questions. For example, what exactly did this person say or do? Why am I reacting so strongly to this? Is there something from my past that this reminds me of? These questions help you shift from reacting to reflecting. You're still feeling the emotions, but you're also starting to create a little distance from them so you can get some perspective. Triggers also have a way of affecting our behavior in ways we don't always see clearly. Have you ever gotten into an argument with someone, and afterward, when you've calmed down, you think, why did I say that, or why did I get so worked up? That's because when you're triggered, your brain goes into a kind of survival mode. Your emotions take over, and you end up acting out of instinct rather than logic. In these moments, you might say or do things that don't actually reflect how you feel or what you believe. You're reacting to the trigger, not the reality. This distortion of reality can lead to some pretty irrational decisions. You might snap at someone for something they didn't actually do, or make a big deal out of something small because it feels huge in the moment. And afterward, when the emotional fog lifts, you're left with the fallout. Maybe you've hurt someone's feelings, or maybe you've created unnecessary tension. All because your emotions were calling the shots instead of your rational mind. It's easy to see how this can become a cycle. When you don't recognize your triggers, they keep showing up, and you keep reacting in the same ways. Over time, these patterns can shape your relationships, your decisions, and even the way you see yourself. If you're constantly being triggered by the same things, it can start to feel like the world is full of threats or criticisms, even when it's not. And that can make it hard to trust your own perceptions. The good news is, recognizing this pattern is the first step toward breaking it. Once you're aware of your triggers, you can start to interrupt the cycle. Instead of reacting automatically, you can pause, take a breath, and choose how to respond. This doesn't mean your emotions will disappear, they won't. But it does mean you can stop letting them control your actions. Triggers are powerful, but they don't have to run your life. By understanding what they are and how they work, you can start to see them for what they are, echoes of the past, not reflections of the present. And once you see them clearly, you can start to take back control over how you respond, even in the heat of the moment. The trigger game. Let's start with a simple game you've probably played before, 2 truths and a lie. It's a fun icebreaker, right? People share 3 statements about themselves, 2 that are true and 1 that's a lie, and the others have to guess which one is false. Seems harmless enough. But, if you've ever played this game, you know how it can sometimes trigger unexpected reactions. Someone says something that challenges what you thought you knew about them, or worse, maybe it makes you question something about yourself. Imagine you're playing with a group of friends, and one of them says, "I've never been afraid to speak my mind. I once backpacked through Europe for a month, and I'm a huge fan of country music." Now, you know this person as someone who's usually pretty quiet, so you immediately think the first one is a lie. But then, they reveal that the country music fandom was the lie, and suddenly you're left wondering, how did I misjudge them so badly? That's where the magic, or chaos, of 2 truths and a lie comes in. It's not just about guessing the lie, it's about confronting your assumptions, and sometimes, your insecurities. In this game, a simple statement can poke at deeply held beliefs, values, or personal narratives. You thought you knew your friend, but now you're questioning that. And depending on your emotional landscape, this seemingly innocent game can provoke a whole whirlwind of feelings. Maybe you feel embarrassed for getting it wrong, maybe you feel defensive about what this says about your judgment, or maybe you're annoyed at your friend for tricking you. These reactions don't come out of nowhere. They're tied to our personal triggers. In this case, it's not even about the facts of the game, it's about what those facts or lies poke at inside you. And trust me, the more trivial the trigger seems, the more deeply it might be rooted in some larger issue you haven't faced yet. Now let's talk about humor. If there's one thing that can really push your buttons without you even realizing it, it's a joke. Humor has this way of sneaking in under the radar, and before you know it, a harmless laugh has turned into an uncomfortable moment. That's because humor often dances around discomfort. It's a socially acceptable way of bringing up things that are otherwise hard to talk about. But sometimes, that joke isn't so funny when it touches a sore spot. Imagine you're at a party, and someone jokes, "Oh, you're always so quiet," probably planning world domination in your head. Everyone laughs, including you, but deep down, you've always felt self-conscious about being the quiet one in social situations. Suddenly, this little joke makes you feel exposed. On the surface, it's funny. But underneath, it's like someone just pointed out something you've tried hard to ignore about yourself. Humor does that. It can make us laugh and squirm at the same time. And the squirming? That's where the personal trigger comes into play. The discomfort we feel in those moments is like a spotlight shining on our emotional vulnerabilities, those places in us that feel insecure or unresolved. And humor, whether we realize it or not, often reveals those insecurities. This is why, sometimes, a joke can feel like a personal attack, even when it wasn't meant to be. It's not because the joke itself was cruel or mean-spirited, but because it tapped into something raw inside us. If you've ever found yourself laughing at a joke while simultaneously feeling a sting, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that moment where humor and discomfort intersect, and suddenly, you're face to face with a trigger you didn't even know was there. This brings us to another important point: feeling provoked. When someone says or does something that sets you off, it's often because they've touched on something sensitive. Think about it: if a comment doesn't hit a sore spot, it probably rolls off your back without a second thought. But if it does, that's when things get messy. Being provoked isn't just about someone being rude or insensitive, it's about them unknowingly pressing on one of your emotional bruises. Picture this: you're having a conversation with a friend, and they casually mention that they don't think people should care so much about getting promotions at work. You're immediately triggered, not because of the comment itself, but because you've been working your butt off trying to prove yourself in your job. Suddenly, what they said feels like a direct attack on your values, your goals, maybe even your identity. But here's the thing: it's not about them. It's about you. When we feel provoked, it's like a mirror reflecting our own emotional vulnerabilities. It's not really about the other person or what they said, it's about what's unresolved in us. That comment about promotions didn't sting because it was objectively offensive, it stung because it hit a nerve that's already sensitive. It poked at your deeper feelings of worth, success, or maybe even inadequacy. In moments like these, we're given a choice. We can lash out, defend ourselves, or retreat. Or, we can pause and ask ourselves, why is this bothering me so much? What's really going on here? That discomfort is an opportunity to dig deeper, to explore what's behind the trigger and, eventually, to heal those parts of ourselves that are more fragile than we'd like to admit. Here's the thing: triggers are powerful. They can make you feel defensive, angry, hurt, or ashamed in a matter of seconds. But they're also incredibly revealing. They show us where we're vulnerable, where we might need to do some inner work, and where our unresolved emotions are lying just beneath the surface. Think back to the last time you felt truly provoked by something. Maybe it was a snarky comment from a coworker, or a passive-aggressive remark from a family member. Whatever it was, it's likely that your reaction wasn't just about the comment itself, it was about something deeper. Maybe it reminded you of feeling undervalued or misunderstood in the past. Maybe it touched on a fear of not being good enough, or a lingering insecurity that you've tried to push aside. Whatever the case, that feeling of being provoked was a window into your own emotional landscape. The beauty of recognizing these moments is that they offer us a chance to grow. When we feel provoked, we're not just reacting to the person in front of us, we're reacting to our own history, our own stories, and our own wounds. And while that might sound a little heavy, it's also incredibly freeing. Because once you know what's triggering you, you can start to work through it. You can take control of your reactions instead of letting them control you. It's not easy. No one likes to feel vulnerable, and it's tempting to brush off these uncomfortable moments or blame the other person for pushing your buttons. But if you're willing to sit with that discomfort and dig into why it's there, you can start to heal those emotional bruises. And over time, those things that used to provoke you will have less power. The next time you feel triggered, whether it's in a game of two truths and a lie, during a joke, or in a heated conversation, take a moment to pause. Ask yourself, what's really going on here? Why does this bother me so much? And most importantly, what can I learn from this? That's where the real power lies, not in avoiding triggers, but in facing them head-on and using them as opportunities to better understand ourselves. Triggers, as frustrating as they can be, are like emotional roadmaps. They show us where we've been, what we're carrying, and where we might need to go next in our personal growth. So the next time something pushes your buttons, remember, it's not just about the situation in front of you, it's about what's happening inside you. And that's where the real work begins. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your subscription helps us keep creating content with love and dedication. The role of triggers in our decisions. Whether it's buying something we don't need or picking a fight in a relationship, triggers have a way of running the show if we're not paying attention. And let's be honest, how often are we really paying attention? Most of the time, we're on autopilot, just reacting to stuff, and before we know it, we've made a decision that makes us go, wait, why did I do that? Take impulsive purchases, for example. You've had a rough day at work, and on your way home, you see a sale sign in the window of your favorite store. Suddenly, that pair of shoes you don't really need is calling your name. In the moment, buying them feels like self-care, right? Like you're treating yourself because you deserve it after dealing with all that stress. But if you step back, what's really happening is you're triggered. Maybe your day at work made you feel undervalued, unappreciated, or just plain tired, and now buying something is a way to soothe those feelings. It's not about the shoes at all, it's about filling that emotional gap. The problem is, these kinds of decisions tend to backfire. You buy the shoes, feel a little better for a few minutes, and then reality sets in. You realize you spent money you shouldn't have, or maybe the shoes don't even make you as happy as you thought they would. That's the thing with emotional triggers, they make us act on impulse, and those impulses usually lead to decisions we regret. Or how about this classic relationship scenario? You've had a long day, you're tired, and your partner comes home and makes a casual comment like, "The kitchen's kind of messy, huh?" For whatever reason, that comment hits a nerve. Maybe it feels like they're criticizing you, or maybe you're just already feeling overwhelmed, and suddenly, you snap. Instead of saying, "Yeah, I'll clean it up later," you're launching into a whole thing about how they never help around the house, or how they don't appreciate how hard you work. You've turned a little comment into a full-blown argument. What's really happening here? You're triggered. Maybe it's because you're feeling unappreciated, or maybe it's tapping into an old wound from a past relationship where you felt like nothing you did was good enough. Whatever the case, your reaction isn't about the comment itself, it's about the emotional baggage it stirred up. These kinds of decisions, whether it's buying something you don't need or escalating a small comment into an argument, come from automatic responses. They're part of a cycle where we get triggered, react without thinking, and end up making choices based on feelings rather than logic. And the more often this happens, the more it becomes a pattern in our lives. Let's break down how this cycle works. It starts with a trigger, something happens that sets off an emotional reaction. It could be something small, like someone cutting you off in traffic, or something bigger, like a tense conversation with a friend. But once the trigger happens, your brain kicks into gear. The emotional part of your brain, the amygdala, lights up, and suddenly, you're in fight or flight mode. You're not thinking clearly, you're reacting. This is when the automatic response comes in. Instead of pausing to consider your options, you go with the first thing that pops into your head. Maybe it's honking your horn and yelling at the driver who cut you off. Maybe it's sending a passive-aggressive text to your friend. Whatever it is, it happens fast, without much thought behind it. And because it's driven by emotion, it's usually not the best decision. Once the reaction happens, the final part of the cycle is the fallout. You might feel guilty or regretful, or maybe your actions make things worse. Now you've not only been triggered, but you've also made a decision that you have to deal with afterward, And the kicker? If you're not aware of what's happening, this cycle keeps repeating. Every time you get triggered, you react the same way, and you keep making the same kinds of decisions that leave you feeling frustrated or stuck. So, how do you break the cycle? The first step is recognizing when you're triggered. This isn't easy because, as I said earlier, these reactions happen fast. But there are some signs you can look for. For one, pay attention to your body. When you're triggered, your body usually reacts before your mind does. Maybe your heart starts racing, your palms get sweaty, or you feel a tightness in your chest. These physical sensations are your body's way of telling you something's up. Another clue is the intensity of your emotions. If you're feeling a sudden surge of anger, frustration, or anxiety, that's a pretty good sign that you're triggered. The key is to notice these feelings without immediately acting on them. It's hard, I know, but the more you practice, the better you get at it. Once you realize you're triggered, the next step is to pause. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Just taking a moment to breathe and step back from the situation can make a huge difference. It gives you time to think instead of react, and that's when you can start making more intentional decisions. Here's an example. Let's say you're about to fire off an angry text to someone who just upset you. Instead of hitting send right away, pause for a second. Ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Why am I so upset? By identifying the emotion behind the trigger, you give yourself a chance to respond more thoughtfully. Maybe you realize you're not actually angry at the person, but rather feeling hurt or misunderstood. That insight can change how you respond. Maybe instead of an angry text, you write something that opens up a more productive conversation. Pausing also helps break the automatic response loop. When you interrupt the cycle with a moment of reflection, you're no longer reacting on autopilot. You're making a conscious choice about how to respond, and that choice is more likely to lead to a better outcome. Another strategy for breaking the influence of triggers is reframing the situation. This is especially helpful in scenarios where you feel criticized or judged. Let's go back to the example of your partner commenting on the messy kitchen. Instead of immediately assuming they're criticizing you, try to reframe it. Maybe they're just making an observation, or maybe they're stressed out about something completely unrelated. By reframing the comment, you take the emotional charge out of it, which makes it easier to respond calmly. It also helps to remind yourself that not everything is about you. This sounds harsh, but it's true. A lot of times, we get triggered because we take things personally, when in reality, the other person's actions or words have nothing to do with us. That driver who cut you off, they're probably just in a rush, and it's not a personal attack on your driving skills. Your partner's comment about the kitchen? Maybe they're just tired after a long day, and it has nothing to do with how you keep the house. When you stop taking everything so personally, you take away the power of the trigger. A final tool for breaking the cycle of triggers is self-compassion. We're all going to get triggered sometimes. It's just part of being human. The goal isn't to eliminate triggers altogether, that's impossible. Instead, it's about learning how to handle them with more grace. When you do get triggered and make a poor decision, don't beat yourself up. Recognize it, learn from it, and move on. The more self-compassion you practice, the easier it becomes to manage your triggers without letting them control you. Breaking the cycle of triggers isn't easy, but it's doable. It starts with awareness, recognizing when you're triggered and how that's influencing your decisions. From there, it's about practicing the pause, reframing situations, and giving yourself a little grace along the way. Over time, you'll find that you're not just reacting to life, you're responding with intention, and that makes all the difference. Building resilience. Maybe it's that passive-aggressive comment from a coworker, or your partner forgetting to text you back when you're already having a rough day. Whatever it is, those triggers are always lurking, waiting to knock us off balance. This is where emotional resilience comes in. It's the ability to bounce back when life throws a curveball and not let a small moment turn into a bad day or, worse, a full-blown existential crisis. Emotional resilience is like having an emotional shock absorber. It doesn't mean that you won't feel upset or triggered, it means that you can recover more quickly and not let those moments completely derail you. Think of it like this: you spill coffee on your shirt right before a big meeting. If you've got emotional resilience, you might curse under your breath for a second, wipe it off, and get on with your day. Without it, that coffee stain becomes the reason your whole day is ruined, and suddenly you're spiraling, convinced you're doomed to fail at everything. Why is emotional resilience so important? Well, for one, life is unpredictable, and you can't control what's going to happen around you. But you can control how you respond. Emotional resilience is essential for mental health because it stops you from living in a state of constant reaction. Instead of being a victim to your emotions, you start to feel like you've got some control. And when you're in control, you're more capable of handling stress, managing relationships, and growing as a person. Now, let's get into the good stuff, the how. This is where the CEO method comes into play. I know, it sounds fancy, but stay with me. The CEO method stands for calm, envision, opposite action. It's a practical strategy for dealing with emotional triggers in the moment. Let's break it down. Step 1, calm. When you're triggered, your body goes into overdrive, your heart starts pounding, your face might get hot, and your mind is racing with all the things you want to say, or scream. The first thing you need to do is hit the brakes. Calm yourself down. This is easier said than done, right? But there are a few simple tricks that work surprisingly well. Start by taking a deep breath. I know, you've heard this a million times, but deep breathing actually signals to your brain that the crisis is over. Even just a few seconds of focusing on your breath can make a huge difference. You're literally giving your brain time to switch from the emotional part, the amygdala, which is all about fight or flight, to the rational part, the prefrontal cortex, which is where all your logical thinking happens. Let's say you're in the middle of a heated argument with a friend. They say something that really cuts deep, and you feel that familiar rush of anger. In this moment, your instinct might be to snap back with something hurtful, or maybe just storm off. But instead of reacting, you stop. You take a deep breath, and even though you're still mad, you're giving yourself a moment to get out of that emotional haze. This is where emotional resilience starts, it's in that pause. Step 2, envision. Once you've calmed yourself down, the next step is to envision how you actually want to handle the situation. This is where you imagine the best version of yourself, handling the moment with grace and maturity. Sounds cheesy, right? But trust me, this works. When you take a second to visualize yourself responding in a calm, thoughtful way, you're much more likely to act that way. Let's go back to that argument with your friend. After you've taken a deep breath and calmed down, ask yourself, what do I want to happen here? What's the outcome I'm hoping for? Maybe you realize you don't actually want to escalate the argument. What you want is to feel understood and to resolve the conflict. By envisioning the kind of response that will help you get there, you're priming yourself to act in a way that's aligned with that goal. Here's another example. You're in a meeting at work, and your boss criticizes something you worked really hard on. Instantly, you feel defensive. Your first instinct is to justify yourself or maybe even snap back. But instead, you pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, how do I want to respond to this? Do I want to look defensive, or do I want to show that I'm open to feedback and professional? You envision yourself handling the situation with calm confidence, and suddenly, you've shifted from reacting emotionally to responding intentionally. This is the magic of the envision step. It gets you out of your head and into a place where you're making choices instead of letting your emotions make choices for you. Step 3, opposite action. This is where things get interesting. Opposite action is about doing exactly the opposite of what your emotions are telling you to do in the moment. This is powerful because, when you're triggered, your emotions are usually leading you in a direction that's not helpful. Maybe your anger is telling you to yell, or your fear is telling you to avoid a situation. Opposite action flips that script. Let's take a personal example. Imagine you've had a long day, and all you want to do is veg out on the couch. But your partner wants to have a serious conversation. Your initial reaction is to shut down or brush them off because you're tired and don't feel like dealing with it. But instead of following that instinct, you do the opposite. You engage in the conversation, even though it's the last thing you feel like doing. This is opposite action in play. It's about choosing the behavior that's going to lead to a better outcome, even when your emotions are telling you to do the opposite. Or let's say you're feeling anxious about a social event. Every fiber of your being is telling you to cancel and stay home. But you know that avoiding it will only make the anxiety worse in the long run. So, you do the opposite. You go to the event, even though it's uncomfortable. You push through the initial anxiety, and by the end of the night, you might even find that you're having a good time. This is the power of opposite action. It breaks the cycle of automatic, emotion-driven behavior and puts you back in the driver's seat. Practicing the CEO method is like building a muscle. The more you do it, the easier it gets, and over time, you'll find that you're more resilient in the face of triggers. At first, it's going to feel awkward and unnatural, kind of like trying to walk a different way home when you've taken the same route for years. But with practice, it becomes second nature. Let's talk about some real-life situations where you can apply this. One common trigger for a lot of people is criticism. Whether it's at work, in relationships, or even in casual conversations, criticism can bring up a lot of emotions: defensiveness, insecurity, anger. The next time someone gives you feedback that stings, try the CEO method. First, calm yourself by taking a breath and reminding yourself that this is not a personal attack. Then, envision how you want to respond. Do you want to be defensive, or do you want to show that you're open to improvement? Finally, do the opposite of what your emotions are telling you. Instead of shutting down or getting defensive, engage with the feedback. Ask questions, show interest, and take it as an opportunity to grow. Another situation could be dealing with conflict in a relationship. Say your partner says something that hurts your feelings. Your immediate reaction might be to snap back or give them the silent treatment. But instead of reacting, you use the CEO method. Calm yourself, envision the kind of conversation that would actually help resolve the conflict, and then do the opposite of your initial reaction. Instead of pulling away, lean into the conversation. Express how you're feeling without attacking, and you'll likely find that the conflict gets resolved more smoothly. The CEO method isn't about suppressing your emotions. It's about managing them in a way that gives you control over how you respond. Emotions are always going to be there, but you don't have to let them run the show. By using these steps, you build emotional resilience. You start bouncing back from triggers faster, and those things that used to throw you off your game don't hit as hard anymore. Practicing the CEO method in everyday life will help you build that emotional muscle. Whether it's dealing with a stressful situation at work, handling conflict in your personal life, or even managing your own internal doubts and fears, this method gives you a roadmap for responding with intention rather than emotion. The more you use it, the more resilient you become. And over time, you'll notice that those emotional triggers that used to send you spiraling don't have the same power anymore. Part 2. Anger as an ally. The myth of destructive anger. Anger. It's the emotion everyone loves to hate. We've all been there, feeling that heat rising in our chest, our jaw tightening, maybe even clenching our fists under the table while trying to keep our cool. The truth is, anger gets a bad rap. It's often labeled as destructive, unproductive, or something we should just suppress. But here's the kicker: anger is actually a totally natural emotion. It's part of the human experience, like joy or sadness. The problem isn't anger itself, it's how we've been taught to think about it and, more importantly, how we handle it. Think about it. When was the last time you were told that it's okay to be angry? Probably never. Anger is usually seen as this explosive, uncontrollable force that leads to broken relationships, regrettable decisions, and awkward apologies the next day. We're constantly told to calm down or chill out when we're angry, as if anger is this wild beast that needs to be tamed. But let's flip the script for a minute. What if anger isn't something bad, but actually something necessary? At its core, anger is just an emotional signal that something's wrong. It's like your brain's way of waving a big red flag that says, hey, something here isn't sitting right with me. Whether it's because someone crossed a boundary, something feels unfair, or you're just overwhelmed, anger is your mind's way of letting you know there's a problem that needs attention. It's like pain, it doesn't feel good, but it's useful because it tells you something's off. If we didn't feel anger, we'd let all kinds of injustices or wrongs go unchecked. Anger pushes us to act, to make changes, and to stand up for what we believe in. In that way, it's a pretty powerful force. Now, here's where people get tripped up. Anger isn't inherently bad, but it can become bad depending on how it's expressed. There's a difference between healthy anger, which helps us set boundaries and protect ourselves, and harmful anger, which can turn destructive if it's left unchecked or used in the wrong way. Let me give you an example. Say you're at work, and a coworker constantly interrupts you during meetings. At first, you might let it slide, thinking, okay, no big deal, they're just enthusiastic. But after the 5th time they cut you off mid-sentence, you start feeling that familiar fire of frustration. That anger is a signal that your boundaries are being crossed, you're not being heard, and it's starting to affect your ability to communicate. Now, if you bottle that anger up, it's going to simmer until one day you explode, maybe snapping at them in front of everyone and creating a scene that you'll probably regret. That's what we think of as harmful anger. It builds up until it spills out in a way that damages relationships and makes things worse. But what if, instead, you use that anger as a tool? What if you recognized that fire in your chest and thought, okay, I'm angry because this person is disrespecting my space in the conversation. I need to address this before it gets out of hand? That's healthy anger, it's protective, and it motivates you to assert yourself and fix the issue. So, next time your coworker interrupts, instead of bottling it up, you calmly say, hey, I'd appreciate it if I could finish my thought before we move on. You've used your anger to set a boundary without letting it explode. And guess what? Now you've got your point across, your coworker knows to back off, and no one's feelings are hurt. Anger did its job. Healthy anger is about being proactive, not reactive. When you can harness it, it helps you protect your values and boundaries in a way that's constructive, rather than destructive. It's the difference between using anger as a shield to defend yourself and using it as a weapon that ends up hurting others. Another way to think about it is that healthy anger is controlled and directed, while harmful anger is uncontrolled and chaotic. Healthy anger says, this situation isn't okay with me, and I need to do something about it, whereas harmful anger says, I'm going to blow up at whoever's closest to me because I can't handle these emotions. The key is learning how to differentiate between the two and making sure you're channeling that anger in a productive way. Here's another real-life example. Imagine you're in a relationship, and your partner keeps doing something that bothers you, let's say they're always late. At first, you try to be understanding. They're busy, they've got a lot on their plate, you tell yourself. But as it keeps happening, you start to feel angry. Your time isn't being respected, and it's starting to feel personal. Now, you've got two choices. You can either let that anger build until one day you snap at them about being late, which is probably going to lead to an argument, or you can use that anger as a signal that something needs to change. Instead of letting it fester, you bring it up in a calm but firm way. Hey, when you're late all the time, it makes me feel like my time isn't valued. Can we figure out a way to manage our schedules better? That's a boundary-setting moment that comes directly from healthy anger. You're addressing the issue head-on, using the emotion to improve the situation instead of letting it control you. The tricky part is that we've been conditioned to think that all anger is harmful. We're taught to suppress it, to push it down, and to avoid conflict at all costs. But suppressing anger doesn't make it go away, it just turns it into something more toxic. When you bottle up anger, it doesn't disappear, it builds, festers, and eventually explodes in ways that are way worse than if you had dealt with it early on. Let's be honest, how many times have you let something slide, thinking it wasn't worth the fight, only to have it come back and bite you later? Maybe it's a friend who constantly takes advantage of your kindness, or a family member who makes little jabs that hurt more than you let on. You tell yourself to be the bigger person and ignore it. But eventually, all that unresolved anger turns into resentment, and when you finally do blow up, it's a mess. That's harmful anger at work, and it's a direct result of not listening to your emotions when they first started to surface. So, how to use anger constructively? First, you have to recognize it for what it is, a signal that something's wrong. Then, instead of reacting impulsively, take a step back and ask yourself, what is this anger trying to tell me? Maybe it's telling you that your boundaries are being crossed, or maybe it's highlighting a value that's important to you, like respect or fairness. Once you've identified what's at the root of the anger, you can decide how to respond in a way that addresses the issue without making things worse. Think of anger like a smoke alarm. It goes off when something's wrong, but it's up to you to figure out if it's a real fire or just some burnt toast. If it's a real issue, like someone disrespecting your boundaries, then it's time to act. But instead of letting the alarm blare endlessly, you address the fire and put it out before it spreads. On the other hand, if it's just burnt toast, a minor irritation that doesn't need a full-on response, you can acknowledge it, but you don't need to let it take over your emotions. Anger, when used correctly, can be a powerful tool for setting boundaries, standing up for yourself, and protecting what matters most. It's not about avoiding anger or pretending it doesn't exist, it's about using it in a way that's productive, not destructive. The next time you feel that familiar heat rising, don't shut it down, listen to it. Ask yourself what it's trying to tell you and how you can use it to improve the situation. It's not about letting anger run wild, it's about harnessing it, directing it, and using it to protect what's important to you without burning everything down in the process. The brain's hand model. Let's talk about what happens in your brain when you get mad. You know that feeling, the heat creeping up your neck, your heart pounding in your chest, maybe your fists even clenching. Before you know it, you're saying or doing something that later has you thinking, why did I react like that? Well, as it turns out, there's a pretty fascinating reason for this, and it all comes down to two key players in your brain, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Here's a quick breakdown. The amygdala is that little almond-shaped part of your brain responsible for your fight or flight response. It's quick to react, especially when it senses danger, stress, or, yep, you guessed it, anger. The amygdala is like the brain's emotional watchdog. If it thinks something's off, it barks loudly. And when it barks, your body responds, your heart rate picks up, adrenaline surges, and you're ready to either throw hands or run for the hills. This is great if you're facing an actual threat, like a bear or a speeding car. But not so helpful when the danger is your roommate leaving dirty dishes in the sink again. Enter the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain. This is the CEO of your brain, the part that makes decisions, plans, and reasons. The prefrontal cortex is like the wise elder that steps in and says, okay, let's think this through. It helps regulate your emotions, offering a bit of perspective when things get heated. So, when you're about to go off on someone for a minor annoyance, your prefrontal cortex is there to pull you back and say, maybe this isn't worth blowing up over. But here's the catch, when the amygdala takes over, it can kind of hijack the whole system. Imagine your brain like a well-oiled machine, with the prefrontal cortex running the show most of the time. When you get angry, the amygdala throws a wrench in the works. It's what some neuroscientists call flipping the lid. You know that moment when you just lose it and rational thinking goes out the window? That's the amygdala doing its thing. The brain is flooded with emotion, and the prefrontal cortex, the part that should be stepping in to calm things down, is temporarily offline. This is why you might say or do things in the heat of anger that you'd never dream of doing when you're calm. The prefrontal cortex isn't there to stop you, so the amygdala runs wild. Here's an example, you're in the middle of a conversation with your partner, and suddenly, they make a comment that hits a nerve. Maybe it's something small like, you're always late, or you never listen. Before you even have a chance to think about it, you feel that wave of anger hit you. Your amygdala is on high alert, and it's ready to fight. The next thing you know, you're saying something harsh in return, maybe something like, oh, well, maybe if you weren't so controlling, I'd want to be around more. Boom, prefrontal cortex out the window, amygdala in charge. Later, you might feel bad and wonder why you overreacted, but in the moment, it felt like the only option. This flipping the lid process happens fast, too, way faster than you can consciously stop it. The amygdala is built for speed because, evolutionarily speaking, it had to be. Back when we were dealing with actual threats to our survival, like predators, the amygdala's job was to react immediately, without waiting for the prefrontal cortex to weigh in. The problem is, in modern life, the threats we're facing aren't usually life or death. But the amygdala doesn't know that. So it treats your partner's snide remark or your boss's criticism like it's a tiger ready to pounce. Okay, so now we know how anger hijacks the brain. But how do we get that rational prefrontal cortex back online? The good news is, you're not doomed to flip your lid every time you get mad. There are ways to calm down and regain control, and it all starts with understanding how to reset your brain when the amygdala takes over. One of the best techniques to calm your brain down is as simple as breathing. Yep, breathing. When you're angry, your breathing tends to get shallow and fast, which only fuels the fight or flight response. By taking slow, deep breaths, you're essentially sending a signal to your brain that the threat has passed and it's safe to relax. Deep breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for calming you down. It's like flipping a switch that says, okay, time to cool off. Here's how it works in practice. The next time you feel that wave of anger start to rise, try focusing on your breath. Take a deep inhale for 4 counts, hold it for 4, and then exhale slowly for another 4 counts. Repeat this a few times. What you're doing is giving your prefrontal cortex the time it needs to come back online. It's like putting the brakes on the amygdala's runaway train. Another technique is grounding yourself in the present moment. When anger takes over, your thoughts tend to spiral. Maybe you start thinking about every little thing that's ever annoyed you about the situation or person. Grounding helps you pull back from that mental spiral. One way to do this is by paying attention to your surroundings. What do you see, hear, feel? For example, if you're feeling angry during a conversation, you might notice the texture of the chair you're sitting on, the color of the walls, or the sound of your own breathing. This helps break the cycle of rumination and puts you back in control. You can also use what's called labeling the emotion. It sounds simple, but it's surprisingly effective. When you're in the middle of an anger storm, take a second to mentally label what you're feeling. Just saying to yourself, "I'm angry right now," or "I'm feeling frustrated," can help put some distance between you and the emotion. When you label an emotion, it shifts activity away from the amygdala and towards the prefrontal cortex, giving you the space to think more clearly. Let's throw another real-life example into the mix. Say you're stuck in traffic and someone cuts you off. Your amygdala immediately wants to go into road rage mode, right? But instead of slamming on the horn and yelling at your windshield, try this. Take a deep breath, notice how your hands feel on the steering wheel, and say to yourself, "I'm angry because that was rude, but it's not the end of the world." By grounding yourself and labeling the emotion, you're giving your brain a chance to calm down, which means you're less likely to arrive at your destination a stressed-out mess. The key to regaining control during moments of anger is to engage your prefrontal cortex. Once you're able to bring it back online, you can start thinking more clearly and make better decisions. It's not about suppressing the anger, it's about managing it in a way that's productive, not reactive. You don't want to deny your anger, but you also don't want it to take over and make choices for you. This is something that takes practice. You're not going to get it right every time, and that's okay. The goal is to become more aware of when your amygdala is taking over and to have tools in place to bring your rational brain back into the mix. Over time, as you practice these techniques, you'll find that you're able to handle anger more effectively. You won't be flipping your lid as often, and when you do, you'll have the tools to flip it back on before things get out of hand. The brain's hand model, understanding how anger functions in the brain, is a game changer. Once you know what's happening up there when you're angry, you can start to take control of it. You can use techniques like deep breathing, grounding, and labeling to calm your amygdala down and get your prefrontal cortex back in charge. So, the next time you feel anger bubbling up, remember, it's not about stopping the emotion. It's about keeping the brain's emotional watchdog on a leash and letting the wise elder step in before things get messy. Strategies. Be honest, when you're angry, the last thing you want to hear is "just take a deep breath." It sounds so simple, so basic, that it almost feels like a joke. But as much as we roll our eyes at the advice, there's actual science behind why it works. When you're in the middle of feeling pissed off, your body is doing a lot more than just pumping up your emotions, it's kicking into fight or flight mode. Your heart starts racing, your muscles tense up, and your breathing becomes quick and shallow. It's your body's way of gearing up for battle, even if the enemy is just your roommate who keeps leaving dirty socks on the floor. Deep breathing, though, is like a magic button that tells your brain, "Hey, everything's okay. No need to fight." It's not just a feel-good wellness tip, it's actually a way to hack into your body's nervous system. When you slow down your breathing, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is basically the opposite of your fight or flight response. Instead of gearing up for a showdown, your body starts to relax, your heart rate slows down, and your brain gets the message that the crisis is over. Think about the last time you were really mad. Maybe someone cut you off in traffic, and before you knew it, you were gripping the steering wheel like you were about to rip it off. Your body went into overdrive, and everything felt tense, right? But what if, in that moment, you took a deep breath, like a really deep one, filling your lungs until they felt like they might pop, then slowly exhaling all that tension out? You'd be surprised at how much calmer you'd feel, even after just 1 or 2 deep breaths. It's like hitting a reset button for your body, and it gives you just enough of a pause to stop yourself from doing something you'll regret later, like flipping off the person in the other car or yelling at your radio. Now, deep breathing is great, but what if I told you there's something even more powerful you can do to manage your anger? It's called naming your emotions. Yep, literally just saying what you're feeling. There's this wild thing that happens in the brain when you name your emotions. It's like your brain suddenly goes, "Oh, okay, I get it now." Naming your feelings actually reduces the intensity of those emotions. It's almost like once you say, "I'm angry," the anger doesn't feel the need to scream so loud. Here's the science behind it. When you identify and label an emotion, you're shifting activity from the emotional part of your brain, the amygdala, to the thinking part, the prefrontal cortex. It's like putting your brain in a more logical, less emotional state. So instead of feeling like your anger is in control, you're the one in charge. It's like naming the monster under the bed. It feels way less scary once you know what it is. Picture this: you're having a frustrating conversation with a friend, and they keep interrupting you. You feel that familiar heat rising in your chest. Instead of letting it boil over, you stop for a second and say to yourself, "I'm feeling really angry right now." By naming the emotion, you're giving yourself a moment to step back and see the situation for what it is. You're angry, sure, but now that you've labeled it, it doesn't feel as overwhelming. You're more likely to handle the situation calmly rather than blowing up at your friend for cutting you off mid-sentence. It might sound too simple to be true, but it works. Research shows that when people label their emotions, they experience less emotional distress. It's kind of like when you vent to someone about how you're feeling. Just putting it into words helps you feel better, even if nothing about the situation has changed. You're acknowledging the emotion, which gives you a little bit of distance from it, and that distance is all you need to regain some control. Now, let's get into the fun part, doing the exact opposite of what your anger wants you to do. This is what psychologists call opposite action, and it's a super effective way to handle anger in a healthier way. Here's how it works. When you're angry, your emotions are urging you to do something impulsive, maybe yell, slam a door, or storm out of the room. Opposite action is about doing, well, the opposite. If your anger is telling you to shout, opposite action says, "Hey, maybe try speaking calmly instead." If your anger is urging you to walk away, opposite action encourages you to stay and have the conversation instead of avoiding it. Let me paint a picture. Imagine you're in an argument with your partner. They say something that really ticks you off, and your first instinct is to storm out of the room, maybe throw in a dramatic door slam for good measure. But instead, you pause. You take a deep breath. You name what you're feeling, "I'm angry right now," and then you do the opposite of what your emotions are telling you. Instead of leaving, you stay. Instead of shouting, you lower your voice. Opposite action doesn't mean ignoring your anger, it means responding to it in a way that's more productive. You're still acknowledging the emotion, but you're choosing a response that won't escalate the situation. This doesn't mean you're just bottling up your anger. In fact, it's the opposite. You're expressing your anger in a way that's healthy and constructive. Anger isn't the problem, it's what you do with it that matters. So, when you practice opposite action, you're taking that powerful emotion and using it to make things better, not worse. Let's try another example. You're at work, and a coworker takes credit for something you did. Cue the anger. Your first thought might be to confront them in front of everyone and let them know exactly what you think of them. But instead, you try opposite action. You take a few deep breaths, name the emotion, "I'm really frustrated right now," and then you approach the situation calmly. Maybe you talk to your coworker one-on-one instead of calling them out in front of everyone. Or maybe you bring it up with your boss in a professional way. Either way, you've managed your anger without letting it control you. The beauty of opposite action is that it helps you break the cycle of reacting to anger in ways that you'll regret later. When you practice opposite action, you're training your brain to respond to anger in a healthier, more effective way. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. Pretty soon, your default response won't be to lash out or shut down, it'll be to take a breath, name the emotion, and act in a way that actually solves the problem. At the end of the day, anger is just an emotion like any other. It's not something to be afraid of, and it's not something to suppress. It's a signal that something's wrong, and it's up to you to figure out how to respond. With tools like deep breathing, naming your emotions, and opposite action, you can handle anger in a way that feels empowering instead of overwhelming. And the best part? You'll start to see how much more in control you feel, even when things get heated. Anger is a warning signal. Anger is usually treated like that rude guest at a party, the one everyone wishes would just leave already. But what if, instead of seeing anger as a bad thing, we started viewing it as a helpful signal? Anger is often a flashing neon sign from your brain saying, "Hey, something's not right here." It's like your internal alarm system going off when your boundaries have been crossed. And let's be clear, boundaries aren't just about physical space. They can be emotional, mental, or even about your time and energy. When those boundaries get violated, anger is often the first responder. Think about the last time you got angry. Maybe it was something seemingly small, like your roommate eating the last slice of pizza you were saving. Sure, it's just pizza, but it's also about respect. You had a boundary there, unspoken or not, that the pizza was yours. When your roommate took it, that boundary got stomped on, and boom, anger. It wasn't really about the slice, it was about your boundary being crossed. Or maybe it's a work situation. Let's say you've been working on a project for weeks, and at the last minute, your boss hands it over to someone else for finishing touches, essentially taking your hard work and handing off the credit. That fire you feel in your gut? That's anger, but it's also a sign that a boundary has been crossed, your effort, your time, your dedication weren't respected. Anger in this context is your brain's way of saying, "Hey, this isn't okay. Something needs to change." The key here is recognizing that anger, while uncomfortable, is telling you something important. It's signaling that you've hit a limit, and it's time to take a closer look at what's going on. The trick isn't to shove the anger down or let it explode out of control, it's to listen to it and figure out what it's trying to tell you. So, what is anger telling you? Usually, it's pointing to an area where something's out of balance, and that's where the real work begins. Instead of reacting to anger with a quick fix, like yelling at your roommate or silently resenting your boss, what if you used it as a compass? Anger can actually help guide you to the places in your life where boundaries need to be strengthened, conversations need to happen, or changes need to be made. Here's an example. Imagine you've been saying yes to every social invitation that comes your way, even though you're feeling exhausted and just want some time to yourself. You keep showing up for people, but inside, you're starting to feel drained. Eventually, you start getting annoyed with your friends for asking you to hang out. Every new invitation feels like a demand, and your irritation builds. You're snapping at people for no reason, or worse, avoiding their calls altogether. That irritation? It's anger's little cousin. It's a sign that you've been crossing your own boundaries, overextending yourself to make others happy while ignoring your own needs. Anger in this situation is a signal that something's gotta give. Maybe it's time to set firmer boundaries around your time and energy. You might need to start saying no more often, and anger is there to push you in that direction. The point is, anger can be a helpful indicator that changes are needed in your life. Instead of seeing it as something to fear or suppress, try to think of anger as your emotional GPS, rerouting you toward healthier boundaries or necessary changes. Let's take it a step further. Once you've recognized what your anger is pointing to, how do you transform that initial spark of anger into something productive? This is where the magic happens. Instead of bottling up your anger or letting it blow up, you can channel it into action that actually improves your life and relationships. For instance, back to the work scenario where your boss gave your project away. Instead of stewing in resentment or making passive-aggressive comments in meetings, you use that anger as fuel to have a constructive conversation. Maybe you sit down with your boss and say, "I noticed that my project was handed off at the last minute. I'd like to be more involved in the final stages next time." You've turned your anger into a boundary-setting moment, letting your boss know how you want to be treated going forward. This isn't about lashing out, it's about standing up for yourself and ensuring that your work is respected. Or, in the case of your roommate and the pizza, yeah, it's annoying, but maybe it's also an opportunity to have a conversation about mutual respect. Instead of getting passive-aggressive and hiding all the snacks in your room, you might say, "Hey, when you ate the last slice of pizza, I felt disrespected because I was saving it. Can we agree to ask before finishing something that belongs to someone else?" You're using your anger not to punish, but to address the issue head-on, protecting your boundary in a healthy way. It's easy to think of anger as something that destroys relationships, but when handled properly, it can actually strengthen them. When you communicate what's bothering you, you give people a chance to understand your needs and make adjustments. Relationships aren't about never getting angry, they're about learning to navigate those moments of anger in ways that lead to growth instead of conflict. Here's another example. Let's say you've been feeling increasingly frustrated with a friend who keeps canceling plans at the last minute. You're angry, not just because your plans got derailed, but because you feel like your time isn't being respected. You could let the anger build, eventually leading to a blow-up where you accuse them of being unreliable and selfish. But instead, you use that anger as a signal to have an honest conversation. You might say, "Hey, I've noticed you've canceled a lot lately, and it's been frustrating. I understand things come up, but I'd appreciate it if we could make plans that you're sure you can keep." That conversation, fueled by your anger, helps set a boundary and opens the door to a more respectful, balanced friendship. Transforming anger into a tool for growth isn't about suppressing the emotion or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about taking that fiery energy and using it to create positive change, whether that's reinforcing boundaries, having difficult conversations, or making decisions that protect your emotional well-being. The beautiful thing about anger is that it's not there to sabotage you. It's there to guide you. It's there to push you toward better relationships, stronger boundaries, and a more balanced life. When you learn to listen to your anger, really listen, you start to see it as a friend rather than an enemy. Anger becomes less about destruction and more about growth. And let's be honest, anger isn't going anywhere. It's part of being human. So why not learn how to use it in a way that benefits you in your relationships? The next time you feel that familiar burn of anger, instead of letting it control you or trying to shove it down, pause. Ask yourself, what is this telling me? What boundary has been crossed? What needs to change? That's where the power of anger lies, in its ability to point you toward action, to nudge you towards setting boundaries, and to guide you toward the changes that will make your life better. Anger isn't just a warning signal, it's an invitation to grow. Part 3. The Power of Positive Intent. Richie's story. Let's talk about Richie. Richie is your typical teenager, mood swings, sarcastic remarks, and a constant vibe of "I don't care." He's not a bad kid, but like most teens, he has his moments. Now, Richie's dad, Tom, loves his son, but lately, their relationship has been tense. Every interaction seems to be a battle, and Tom feels like no matter what he says, Richie either shuts down or fires back with some biting comment. The house feels like a war zone, with each conversation a potential trigger for conflict. So what's going on? Let's break it down. Richie's dad, Tom, has started assuming the worst. Whenever Richie rolls his eyes or makes a sarcastic comment, Tom's immediate reaction is, he's being disrespectful again. He takes every sigh and every shrug personally, thinking Richie is purposely trying to push his buttons. Tom assumes that Richie is deliberately challenging his authority, and that assumption is slowly driving a wedge between them. One evening, after a long day at work, Tom comes home to find Richie sprawled on the couch, playing video games. The house is a mess, dishes are piled up in the sink, and Richie's backpack is carelessly thrown in the middle of the hallway. Tom feels the anger rising. He's tired, frustrated, and ready for a confrontation. Without even thinking, he snaps, "Can't you ever clean up after yourself? I'm working all day while you sit here doing nothing." Richie, predictably, doesn't react well. He slams down his controller, mutters something under his breath, and stomps off to his room, leaving Tom standing there, fuming. Now, in Tom's mind, Richie's reaction is just more proof that his son doesn't respect him. He assumes Richie is lazy, ungrateful, and couldn't care less about helping out around the house. Tom feels disrespected, and that feeling lingers, making every interaction with Richie feel like an uphill battle. What Tom doesn't realize, though, is that Richie isn't trying to be disrespectful at all. He's just a teenager. Richie spent the day dealing with his own stuff, school was rough, he's stressed about a test, and his friends have been giving him a hard time. He's exhausted, and playing video games is his way of unwinding. When Tom came at him aggressively, Richie's first instinct was to defend himself. From Richie's perspective, his dad didn't ask how his day was or show any interest in what he's going through. Instead, it felt like an attack out of nowhere, so he reacted with frustration. The problem here isn't that Richie is a rebellious kid or that Tom is a bad father. The real issue is the assumption of negative intent. Tom is assuming Richie's actions are driven by laziness or disrespect, but in reality, Richie's just trying to deal with his own teenage problems. This assumption of negative intent is what's fueling their conflict, creating a cycle of misunderstanding and emotional disconnection. But here's where things get interesting. What if Tom changed his perspective? What if, instead of assuming the worst, he started giving Richie the benefit of the doubt? This is where the concept of positive intent comes into play, and it can completely transform the dynamic between them. Let's rewind to that same scenario, but this time, Tom approaches it differently. He comes home, sees the mess and Richie playing video games, and instead of jumping to conclusions, he pauses. He takes a moment to breathe and remind himself that Richie isn't being lazy or disrespectful on purpose, he's just a teenager who's had a long day too. Tom walks over and says, "Hey, Richie. How was your day? I noticed the dishes didn't get done. Can we work together to get the house cleaned up tonight?" Now, Richie might still roll his eyes, but the entire tone of the conversation has shifted. Instead of feeling attacked, Richie feels like his dad is seeing him as a person, not just a problem. He might grumble a bit, but he's much more likely to cooperate because the approach is different. By assuming positive intent, Tom has opened the door to a more respectful and productive interaction. He's giving Richie the space to respond without feeling like he's under attack, and that changes everything. This shift in perspective, from assuming negative intent to assuming positive intent, can drastically improve relationships, especially between parents and children. It's not about letting kids off the hook or ignoring bad behavior, but about approaching situations with empathy rather than defensiveness. When Tom assumes Richie isn't trying to be disrespectful, but is instead just dealing with his own challenges, it makes it easier for Tom to communicate calmly and effectively. The transformation in their relationship doesn't happen overnight, but with each interaction, the dynamic starts to change. Richie begins to feel less like he's constantly under scrutiny, and Tom feels less like he's always fighting a losing battle. They're both more willing to listen to each other, and slowly, the tension in the house starts to ease. But there's more to this story, because it's not just about Richie's behavior. There's another factor at play here, Tom's emotional state. Let's face it, being a parent is stressful, and it's easy for your own emotions to color how you respond to your kids. Tom's long days at work, his exhaustion, and his frustration are all feeding into how he reacts to Richie. When Tom comes home feeling drained, he's more likely to see Richie's behavior through a lens of irritation. He's quick to snap because he's already carrying so much emotional baggage from his day. Parents' emotional states play a huge role in how conflicts with their children unfold. When you're already stressed or overwhelmed, it's easy to misinterpret your child's actions as personal attacks, even when they're not. But when you're calm and centered, it's much easier to respond with patience and understanding. This is why it's so important for parents to manage their own emotions, especially when dealing with conflict. Tom might not be able to change how tough his workday was, but he can take a moment to decompress before engaging with Richie. Maybe it's as simple as taking a few deep breaths when he walks in the door or spending 5 minutes in silence to reset his mood. By managing his own emotional state, Tom can approach situations with Richie from a place of calm rather than frustration, which makes all the difference. Over time, Tom learns that when he's feeling stressed or overwhelmed, it's not the best time to have a serious conversation with Richie. He starts to check in with himself before reacting, asking, "Am I upset because of Richie, or is it because I'm already in a bad mood?" That little bit of self-awareness helps him pause before escalating situations unnecessarily. As Tom becomes more aware of his own emotional state and starts assuming positive intent with Richie, the entire family dynamic shifts. There are still disagreements, of course. Richie's a teenager, after all, but they're no longer explosive. Instead of yelling matches or silent treatment, there are more conversations, more understanding, and more opportunities for growth. Tom's willingness to assume the best in Richie helps Richie feel seen and respected, which makes Richie more likely to return that respect. Richie's story shows us that the way we interpret others' actions, especially in close relationships, has a huge impact on the quality of those relationships. When we assume negative intent, we create conflict where there might not need to be any. But when we give people the benefit of the doubt and approach situations with empathy, we open the door to better communication and deeper connection. And in the end, that's what it's all about, learning to see each other, not as enemies, but as people who are just trying to figure things out. The fundamental attribution error. Here's something we've all done: judge someone else harshly for something, but when we do the exact same thing, we've got a whole list of justifications ready to defend ourselves. You know the feeling: you're driving, and someone cuts you off. Immediately, you're fuming. What a jerk! This guy must think the rules don't apply to him. But flash forward to the next day, and you're running late. You cut someone off because you've got to make it to a meeting. Do you call yourself a jerk? No way. You're thinking, I had no choice. I'm usually a good driver, but I just couldn't be late today. Congratulations, my friend, you've just experienced the fundamental attribution error. This sneaky cognitive bias is all about how we judge people. When it comes to others, we often attribute their behavior to who they are as a person, their character, personality, or general jerkiness, but when it's us, we attribute our actions to our circumstances. We're not bad people, we just had a rough day. But that guy who cut you off? No excuses. He's clearly an inconsiderate human being. Why do we do this? Well, for one, it's easier. It's much simpler to assume that someone else's actions are a reflection of their personality rather than trying to understand the context behind it. If someone's rude to you, it's easier to think, wow, they're really unpleasant, than to consider that maybe they're having a bad day, or they're stressed about something, or they didn't sleep well the night before. But when it's us, oh, we have context in spades. We know exactly why we're snippy, tired, or in a rush, so of course, we cut ourselves some slack. The fundamental attribution error is like giving ourselves a free pass while slapping everyone else with a bad person sticker. This bias shows up everywhere, in our relationships, at work, in line at the grocery store. Let's take a common scenario: your coworker missed a deadline, and your first thought is, they're so lazy, they never get their stuff done on time. You don't know why they missed the deadline, but it's easy to chalk it up to laziness or a lack of commitment. Meanwhile, when you miss a deadline, it's because you had 10 other things on your plate, your boss asked you for last-minute changes, and your Wi-Fi went down. You're not lazy, you're just swamped. The problem is that this bias doesn't just make us judgmental, it creates unnecessary tension, especially in conflicts. Let's say you're in an argument with a friend. They said something that hurt your feelings, and you immediately think, they don't care about me. They're always selfish and never think about how their words affect others. You're attributing their behavior to their character. But when you snap back at them, it's not because you're inconsiderate, it's because you're under a lot of stress, and they caught you at a bad time. See how the fundamental attribution error works against you in conflict resolution? It makes it harder to see things from the other person's perspective because you're busy assigning blame to who they are as a person, rather than considering the context of the situation. This bias is like throwing gasoline on a fire during a conflict. By assuming that someone else's actions are a reflection of their character, we take things more personally, and we're less likely to engage in productive problem solving. You're not trying to resolve the issue anymore, you're just trying to defend yourself or prove that you're in the right. This kind of thinking makes it impossible to understand the other person's side, and that leads to a stalemate where no one's happy. So, how do we overcome the fundamental attribution error? How do we start giving others the same grace and understanding that we so readily give ourselves? Step 1. Assume good intent. This one's tough, especially when someone's actions have hurt you or frustrated you, but it's a game changer. Instead of immediately thinking, they're selfish, try assuming that they didn't mean to upset you. Ask yourself, what could be going on in their life that I'm not seeing? Maybe your friend didn't text you back because they've been swamped at work, or maybe they've been feeling down. By assuming good intent, you open yourself up to the possibility that there's more to the story, and you avoid jumping to negative conclusions about their character. Let's say you're in a situation where someone's being rude to you at a coffee shop. Your gut reaction is to think, wow, what a rude person. But what if, instead, you stopped and considered that maybe they're just having a terrible day? Maybe they got bad news that morning, or they're dealing with something stressful. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps you shift from labeling them as a bad person to recognizing that they're a person who's struggling. Step 2. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. In conflicts, instead of assuming you know why someone did something, ask them. If a coworker misses a deadline, instead of assuming they're lazy, you could ask, "Hey, I noticed the project wasn't done on time. Is everything okay? Was there something that came up?" By asking questions, you give the other person a chance to explain their circumstances, and you might discover that their behavior had nothing to do with laziness at all. Maybe they were dealing with something unexpected, like a family emergency or an overwhelming workload. Asking questions helps diffuse the tension because it shows the other person that you're not rushing to judgment. It opens the door to a conversation rather than a confrontation, and that's where real conflict resolution starts. You're not putting them on the defensive by attacking their character, you're showing that you're interested in understanding what's really going on. Step 3. Flip the script. The next time you catch yourself thinking negatively about someone's actions, stop and flip the situation around. Ask yourself, if I had done that, what would my reasons be? This simple exercise helps you see that maybe the other person had their reasons too. If you're stuck in traffic and someone cuts you off, instead of immediately labeling them as an inconsiderate driver, flip the script and think, if I had cut someone off, it might be because I was in a rush, or I didn't see them. This trick forces you to see the situation from their perspective, which can soften your reaction and make you more empathetic. Imagine this, you're waiting for your friend at a restaurant, and they're 20 minutes late. Your first thought might be, they're so inconsiderate. They always keep me waiting. But instead of letting that thought take over, flip the script. Ask yourself, what if I was the one running late? What would my reason be? Maybe they got stuck in traffic, or maybe their boss kept them late at work. Once you see the situation through that lens, it's easier to be patient and understanding, rather than jumping straight to frustration. Step 4. Practice self-awareness. The fundamental attribution error happens so automatically that half the time, we don't even realize we're doing it. That's why it's important to start paying attention to your thought patterns. When you catch yourself making a snap judgment about someone else's actions, pause. Ask yourself, am I judging them based on their character, or am I considering their circumstances? This little moment of self-awareness can make a huge difference in how you interpret and respond to others. For example, let's say you're having a bad day, and your partner forgets to pick up something you asked them to grab from the store. Your first instinct might be to think, they never listen to me. They don't care about what I ask. But with a little self-awareness, you might realize that you're upset about something else, like work stress, and you're taking it out on them. Maybe they genuinely forgot, and it wasn't an intentional slight. When you catch yourself making that judgment, take a breath and remind yourself that their actions probably aren't about disrespect, they just forgot, like you've forgotten things a million times before. The fundamental attribution error is something we all fall into, but it's not something we have to let control us. By becoming more aware of how we judge others and giving them the same benefit of the doubt we give ourselves, we can create more understanding, less conflict, and much more empathy in our interactions. The principle of positive intent. It's a mindset shift that can take the edge off stressful interactions, reduce unnecessary conflict, and make you a much more understanding person. But here's the kicker, it's simple in theory but not always easy in practice. So, what is the principle of positive intent? It's the idea that everyone is doing the best they can with the resources they have at any given moment. This doesn't mean people don't mess up, or that they don't have flaws. It means that, for the most part, people aren't waking up in the morning thinking, how can I make this person's life harder today? They're acting within their own limitations, whether that's emotional, mental, or situational. They might be stressed, tired, distracted, or going through something you know nothing about. Let's look at a classic scenario. You're at the grocery store, and the cashier is super short with you, barely making eye contact and rushing you through the line. Your initial reaction might be to think, wow, this person is so rude. What's their problem? But hold up. What if instead of assuming the worst, you took a second to think, maybe they're having a rough day? Maybe they've been standing here for hours dealing with grumpy customers. Maybe they're stressed about something going on in their life that I can't see. You start to realize it's not personal, it's not about you at all. They're doing the best they can with what they've got in that moment, even if it doesn't look pretty. When you adopt this mindset, your whole outlook shifts. Suddenly, people's behavior doesn't feel like a personal attack, and you don't feel the need to react defensively. Instead of matching their negativity, you're able to stay calm and even compassionate. It's not about excusing bad behavior, but it's about understanding that everyone has stuff going on behind the scenes, and they might not be equipped to handle things perfectly all the time. Let's talk about how adopting this perspective can completely change the way you handle interpersonal challenges. Imagine you're in a relationship, and your partner has been distant or irritable for a few days. Your gut reaction might be to assume they're upset with you, or worse, that they don't care about the relationship anymore. That's a pretty dark rabbit hole to fall down, and it usually leads to tension or even a confrontation. But if you shift your thinking and assume positive intent, you might pause and think, maybe they're dealing with something I don't know about. Maybe they're stressed at work or struggling with something emotionally. Now, instead of confronting them with, "Why are you being so distant? Do you even care about us anymore?" Which, let's be honest, is not going to go over well, you approach the situation with curiosity and compassion. You might say, "Hey, I've noticed you seem a little off lately. Is everything okay? Do you want to talk about what's going on?" By assuming positive intent, you're creating space for a conversation rather than a confrontation, and you're much more likely to get to the root of the issue without escalating things unnecessarily. This shift doesn't just change the outcomes of difficult interactions, it changes you. When you stop assuming the worst in people, you become less reactive, less defensive, and a whole lot more patient. You realize that most of the time, people aren't out to hurt or annoy you. They're just dealing with life the best way they know how. And let's be real, how many times have you been in a bad mood, snapped at someone, and immediately regretted it? You didn't mean to be harsh, you were just overwhelmed, tired, or frustrated. If you want people to give you the benefit of the doubt when you're not at your best, doesn't it make sense to extend that same grace to others? Now, let's talk about applying this principle in conflict situations. Conflict is where assuming positive intent can truly be a game changer. When you're in the heat of an argument, it's easy to assume that the other person is deliberately trying to upset you or that they don't care about your feelings. But this kind of thinking only fuels the fire and makes it harder to resolve the conflict. Instead, try this: assume that the person you're arguing with is not trying to hurt you. Assume that they're doing the best they can with their current emotional or mental resources. Maybe they're feeling misunderstood, frustrated, or defensive, but they're not trying to make your life miserable. For example, imagine you're in an argument with a coworker over how to handle a project. Tensions are high, and you're both getting snippy. If you assume negative intent, you might start thinking, "They're just trying to undermine me. They never respect my ideas." But if you pause and assume positive intent, you might think, maybe they're stressed about the deadline, or maybe they feel like their ideas aren't being heard. Suddenly, the conversation shifts from being about who's right and who's wrong to being about finding a solution together. You might say, "I can see you're passionate about this project. Let's figure out how we can make this work together." You've de-escalated the conflict by not assuming the worst about their intentions. Another practical strategy for applying the principle of positive intent is to practice active listening. When you're in a conflict, instead of formulating your response while the other person is talking, which, let's be honest, we all do, try really listening to what they're saying. Hear them out without jumping to conclusions. When you listen with the assumption that the other person is not trying to attack you, but is instead just trying to express their perspective, it's much easier to respond in a way that's constructive rather than combative. Here's an example: let's say your partner comes home from work and immediately starts venting about their day. You're tired, and your first instinct might be to shut down or snap back with, "I've had a long day too, you know." But if you take a breath and assume positive intent, you can listen to them with empathy. You realize they're not trying to dump their stress on you, they just need a safe space to vent. You respond with something like, "That sounds really tough. I'm here if you want to talk about it." You've turned what could have been a moment of tension into a moment of connection, all by assuming that their behavior wasn't meant to hurt or overwhelm you. Finally, one of the most powerful ways to apply the principle of positive intent is to check in with the other person when you're feeling frustrated. Instead of assuming you know why they're acting a certain way, ask them. If a friend cancels plans last minute for the third time in a row, it's easy to think, "They don't value my time. They don't care about me." But what if, instead of assuming the worst, you asked, "Hey, I've noticed you've canceled a few times recently. Is everything okay? I just want to make sure you're doing all right." You're giving them a chance to explain, and more often than not, you'll find out there's a good reason for their behavior that has nothing to do with not valuing you. This approach not only helps you avoid unnecessary conflict, but it also deepens your relationships. People appreciate being given the benefit of the doubt, and when you approach them with empathy and understanding, they're more likely to respond in kind. It's a two-way street. When you assume positive intent, you create an environment where others feel safe to be open and honest with you, which ultimately leads to stronger, more trusting relationships. The principle of positive intent might sound simple, but it's incredibly powerful. It's about recognizing that we're all just doing our best with what we've got, and that most people aren't out to hurt or frustrate us. When you approach conflicts and challenges with this mindset, you'll find that things don't escalate as easily, and you're able to navigate difficult situations with more empathy and understanding. And let's be real, couldn't we all use a little more of that in our lives? Pronoia, the universe on our side. You've probably heard of paranoia, right? That feeling that everyone's out to get you, that things are going wrong because life is unfair and the universe has some vendetta against you? Now, flip that idea completely on its head, and you've got pronoia. It's the belief that the universe is actually conspiring in your favor. Yep, you read that right, the universe is on your side, helping you out, even when things seem like they're falling apart. Pronoia is like having a personal cheerleader in the cosmos, rooting for you, even in those moments when life feels like it's going off the rails. It's the belief that the challenges you face aren't meant to destroy you but to help you grow, teach you something valuable, or steer you towards something better. Sounds pretty idealistic, right? But here's the thing, when you start viewing the world through the lens of pronoia, everything starts to shift. That flat tire on your way to work? Maybe it delayed you from getting into a bigger accident. That job rejection? Maybe it's clearing the path for a career opportunity that fits you way better. Pronoia isn't about blind optimism, it's about trusting that the universe has your back, even when things feel tough. Let's break it down with an example. Imagine you're running late for an important meeting, and as you rush out the door, your phone slips from your hand and crashes to the ground, shattering the screen. Great. Now, not only are you late, but you're also dealing with a broken phone. In that moment, it's easy to spiral into frustration. Why is this happening to me? But with a pronoia mindset, you might pause and think, okay, this sucks, but what if this is leading to something better? Maybe I'll avoid a traffic jam or bump into someone important when I stop to get my phone fixed. Instead of seeing the situation as a disaster, you see it as part of a bigger plan that's actually working in your favor. Now, let's talk about the magic of reframing obstacles as opportunities. It's not always easy. When life throws a curveball, our first instinct is usually to get frustrated, stressed, or downright angry. But what if every challenge was actually an opportunity in disguise? This is one of the core ideas behind pronoia, that obstacles aren't just setbacks, they're the universe's way of nudging you toward growth and learning. Think about it. When have you ever learned the most? Was it when everything was going smoothly, or was it during times of struggle, when you had to push through and adapt? Take a relationship breakup, for example. In the moment, it feels like the worst thing ever. You're hurt, you're confused, and it feels like your whole world just got flipped upside down. But with a pronoia perspective, you start to see that breakup as an opportunity for self-reflection and growth. Maybe that relationship was holding you back in ways you didn't realize, or maybe it's teaching you what you really need in a partner. By reframing it as a stepping stone instead of a roadblock, you transform the entire experience from something negative into something that's setting you up for something better down the road. Here's another example. Let's say you've been passed over for a promotion at work. Ouch, right? It's easy to feel resentful, like you're being overlooked or undervalued. But with pronoia, you take a step back and think, okay, maybe this happened for a reason. Maybe there's a better opportunity coming, or maybe I need to reassess what I really want in my career. Suddenly, instead of wallowing in frustration, you're using that disappointment as a catalyst for change. Maybe it inspires you to learn a new skill, network with new people, or even pivot to a different career path altogether. The rejection wasn't the end, it was the universe saying, hold on, there's something better around the corner. So, how do you actually apply pronoia in your everyday life? It's one thing to say, the universe has my back, but how do you really live that mindset when things are tough? It starts with small shifts in your thinking. The next time something doesn't go as planned, instead of jumping straight to frustration or anger, pause and ask yourself, what if this is happening for me, not to me? It sounds simple, but that little shift in perspective can make a huge difference. Here's a practical way to use pronoia in your daily life. Start with the minor annoyances. Say you spill coffee on your shirt before an important meeting. Instead of letting it ruin your morning, take a second to think, what if this is setting me up for something better today? Maybe spilling that coffee delays you just enough to avoid getting stuck in traffic, or maybe it sparks a conversation with a coworker that leads to a new opportunity. The point isn't to force positivity but to open yourself up to the idea that setbacks might be part of a bigger, positive picture. Another tool for applying pronoia is gratitude, specifically, gratitude for the challenges. I know, it sounds like a stretch. Be grateful for challenges? Yeah, right. But hear me out. When you start seeing challenges as opportunities for growth, you can actually start to feel grateful for them. Instead of thinking, why me, you start to think, what can I learn from this? It's not about pretending everything's perfect, it's about recognizing that even the tough stuff has value. Take the example of losing a job. In the moment, it's devastating. Your routine is disrupted, your finances are suddenly uncertain, and it feels like the rug's been pulled out from under you. But if you approach it with pronoia, you might think, maybe this is the universe pushing me to pursue something I've been too afraid to try. Maybe this is the chance I've been waiting for to change direction. Suddenly, losing the job isn't just a loss, it's an opportunity. It doesn't make the situation less stressful, but it changes the way you respond to it, turning anxiety into possibility. Finally, pronoia isn't just about reframing the bad stuff, it's about noticing the good stuff too. When you're living with a pronoia mindset, you start to pay more attention to the little ways the universe might be working in your favor. Maybe you're running late, and just as you think you'll never find parking, a spot opens up right in front of your destination. Or maybe you bump into an old friend at exactly the right time, just when you needed a friendly face. Pronoia teaches you to recognize these moments as signs that the universe is helping you out, even in small ways. It's not magic, it's about being open to the idea that life has more in store for you than just random chaos. You're essentially giving yourself permission to trust the process. You stop trying to control everything and start believing that things are unfolding as they're meant to, even if it doesn't make sense in the moment. This mindset doesn't mean bad things won't happen, they will, but it changes how you interpret and respond to them. Instead of feeling defeated by setbacks, you start to see them as part of your journey, guiding you toward growth, learning, and ultimately, a better version of yourself. Pronoia is about choosing to believe that life is on your side. It's about approaching challenges with curiosity instead of frustration and trusting that there's a purpose behind every twist and turn. When you embrace pronoia, you empower yourself to find meaning in the mess, to learn from the obstacles, and to open yourself up to the possibility that the universe really is conspiring in your favor. And honestly, that's a pretty cool way to live. So, after diving into all of this, it's pretty clear, life's gonna throw stuff at you, and a lot of it might feel like a mess. But the good news? You've got tools to handle it. Whether it's learning to bounce back from emotional triggers, using anger as a secret weapon for growth, or trusting that the universe isn't out to get you but actually rooting for you, there's a way through it all. It's about shifting your mindset, taking a deep breath, or 10, and seeing challenges as opportunities, even if you want to scream into a pillow sometimes. Life's not perfect, but with resilience, positive intent, and a little pronoia, you might just find that things aren't as bad as they seem. And who knows? Maybe that flat tire really did save you from something worse. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. Your likes and subscription are very important to us. Help us keep the Books Project alive and continue delivering high-quality content. Wishing you peace, and see you next time.